Few know the name of Walter Heller, one of the first chairs of the Council of Economic Advisers, and an advisor to President Kennedy. In 1968, however, he was a giant in economics who published in all the top journals. Fresh from his years in the Kennedy White House, he was invited to debate the relative importance of fiscal and monetary policy with another giant in economics, Milton Friedman, in a small book published by W. W. Norton and Company. A decade later, PBS invited Heller and Friedman to debate their views on inflation. There is a key moment in that debate that is particularly important for present macroeconomic discussion. At one point, Walter Heller invoked the idea of wage push inflation. The concept is simple enough: if unions or other forces push wages up, prices will go up. Friedman pounced on this statement, arguing that it is tautological. After all, a wage is a price. Saying that rising prices, 'cause rising prices is logically circular. Friedman's pouncing on Heller has, unfortunately, had no effect on American journalists. News shows and economic commentators still repeat variants of the claim made by Heller: rising wages will contribute to inflation. Pick any news channel on any day and you are bound to hear the term wage-driven inflation. For that reason, and because repetition is sometimes necessary, Friedman's case from 1978 must be reiterated in order to reduce the likelihood of this nonsensical being repeated in the media. To be sure, if you mandate higher wages without changing labor productivity, prices will rise. This post hoc ergo propter hoc argument is true. However, it is deceptively true. Mandating rising wages when productivity fails to increase leads to lower output. This is what causes prices to go up. The rising prices in this case are a symptom of fewer goods being produced. In the Consumer Price Index, CPI, this shows up as inflation. However, anyone who inspects the CPI more closely will find that the magnitude of the price increases will depend on the extent of the fall of output. Capital-intensive industries, for example, will have smaller price increases than labor-intensive industries after they reduce their output because of the wage hike. Contrast this with another instance when prices rise: an expansion of the money supply. If a central bank puts more money in circulation, the inherent productivity of economic agents is unchanged. If productivity is unchanged, inflation is only reflecting the greater abundance of money. The new money could enter the economy unevenly, such that output prices and wages are also bid up unevenly. Economists speak of rigidities. If some wages increase before some other wages and other prices, it may precipitate some increases in demand by households, and prices for other goods will increase. However, this is a symptom of inflation induced by the change in the money supply. It is not the cause. In other words, it is only a mirage caused by the messy process of adjusting to changes in the money supply. Not making the distinction between these two cases is logically dangerous. This danger is most visible when discussing the effects of certain public policy. The Biden administration, for example, has pushed for many pro-union labor policies in order to drive up wages. Many conservatives have responded by arguing that this will push wages and prices in turn. Many economists, notably Albert Rees as early as the 1960s, have shown this is not the case. Unions may cause higher prices, but only inasmuch as firms must cut down on production through the firing of some workers. There may be a case to oppose such pro-union policies. It is on the grounds, however, of the effect on output rather than on the grounds of the effect on inflation rates. There is an unrelenting myth that if we raise the minimum wage, it will cause the inflation rate to rise. To keep this from not getting too long, this will mostly focus on 1980s to day of this article's publication. The theory is that if the minimum wage rises, it will cause inflation. It says that corporations will raise prices to recuperate their profits that were lost from the increase of the cost of production, in this case, the increase of the minimum wage. Because employers will have to spend more money on their employees, they will just increase the prices to make it up. It makes sense in theory, but that's not how it works in reality. In 1980, the minimum wage was increased. It went from $2.90 to $3.10. From 1979 to 1980, before the increase, inflation rose 2%, from 11% to 13%. After it was increased, 1980 to 1981, the inflation rate decreased from 13% to 10%. In 1981, the minimum wage was increased to $3.35. We know that in 1980 to 1981, the inflation rate went down by 3% to 10%. After they increased the minimum wage again the next year, between 1981 to 1982, the inflation rate went down more, from 10% to 6%. The next time the minimum wage rose was in 1990 and 1991. In 1989, the inflation rate was 4.8% and rose to 5.4% in 1990. From 1990 to 1991, the minimum wage went up from $3.35 to $3.80, but the inflation rate decreased by 1.2% to 4.2%. The next year, in 1991, the minimum wage rose to $4.25 and again, the inflation rate did not increase. It went down to 3% in 1992. So now you have several minimum wage increases in a row that did not cause the inflation rate to increase over the course of an entire decade. None of the minimum wage increases, in 1980, 1981, 1990, and 1991, resulted in an increase of the yearly inflation rate. In fact, every single time there was a minimum wage increase, there was actually a correlation, I'm not saying a causation, with a decrease in the annual inflation rate. The next two times the minimum wage was increased was in 1996 and 1997. Between 1995 to 1996, the inflation rate rose by 0.2% to 3.0%. After the first minimum wage increase to $4.75, inflation yet again decreased. It went down by 0.7% to 2.3%. In 1997, the minimum wage rose again to $5.15 and the inflation rate decreased. Oh, who could have seen that coming? The inflation rate went down by 0.6% from 2.3% in 1997 to 1.6% in 1998. The previous three sentences contained grammatical and syntax errors in the original article that were corrected. Now you have the last three minimum wage increases, 2007, 2008, and 2009. In 2006, the inflation rate was 3.2%. Between 2007 and 2008, when the minimum wage was raised to $5.85, the inflation rate went up from 2.8% to 3.8%. But once it was raised to $6.55 in 2008, the inflation rate decreased by 4.2%. And for the last minimum wage hike to $7.25, inflation rose 2%. For only two times in recent history since the 1980s has the inflation rising corresponded with a minimum wage increase. It is important to remember, however, that during this time we had a global food crisis and a financial crisis. Inflation was going to rise regardless of whether or not the minimum wage had been increased. So even though the minimum wage increase corresponded with an inflation increase twice, it does not mean that raising the minimum wage triggered an automatic inflation increase. Only 22% of the time, twice, has an increase of the minimum wage corresponded with an increase to the inflation rate. On the other hand, 78% of time that there was a minimum wage increase since 1980, there hasn't been an increase to the annual inflation rate. If raising the minimum wage was going to cause it would have increased, but it didn't, and doesn't. It's a historical reality that can be proven when you look at the minimum wage increases versus historical inflation rates.